I want to say good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, and I welcome all of you who are turned out for this, the second talk in the libraries, a series commemorating the 75th anniversary of the commencement of World War II. Neither Henry nor Crosby Kemper could be here this evening, so I'm filling in. I'm Hal Wirt, professor of history, Kansas City Art Institute, who kicked off the series with a general introduction to this tumultuous year this past January, titled 1939 Into the Abyss. The third talk in this ongoing series is on April 30th, when Dr. Robert Rydell of Montana State University will be here to discuss the 1939 World's Fair. And I hope that you'll all wish to attend. But to the point, this evening's topic is an exploration of the Spanish Civil War and the rise of General Franco, a struggle that divided Europe and lasted over 3 years, beginning in July 1936 and ending in the first 3 months of 1939. The war has often been characterized as a dress rehearsal for World War II, a bitterly fought conflict in which both sides committed repeated atrocities. The Republican government received aid from the USSR, and Franco was supported by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. In many ways, World War II is a war between left and right, a European civil war, as well as a war between a coalition of nation states. Here this evening to elucidate this important historical event is Don Wright, who is the Chief of Research and Publications at the U.S. Army Combat Studies Institute, where he has worked since 2003. He earned his Ph.D. in European and Russian history from Tulane University in 1901, and Don has published on Russo-Japanese War and other aspects of an imperial army on the eve of the First World War. More recently, he has focused on what? Oh, what did I say? I said 2001? I got it. More recently, he focused his research on the campaign in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in 2008, Don co-authored On Point 2, the Army's first historical study of Operation Enduring Freedom, titled A Different Kind of War. This work, for which Don served as a lead author, looked closely at the U.S. Army in the first 4 years of the coalition campaign in Afghanistan. Currently, he serves as the chief of CSI's research and publications team. He served in the United States Army as well. He spent 4 years on active duty as an infantry officer and has held a variety of positions in the Louisiana National Guard and in the United States Army Reserve. He lives with his wife and son in Lawrence, Kansas. Don has agreed to answer questions at the end of this talk, so let's give him a warm welcome. Don, please.
Thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you for that introduction. I would be retired by now and not need to go to work had I been born. I would be retired as well. Exactly. Thank you for coming out on an evening to listen to a short discussion, relatively brief, about a very complex topic, and that's the Spanish Civil War. There's not a lot of interest, even among historians of Europe, in the Spanish Civil War. There's a variety of reasons, that is, we'll get into that. But let me start tonight, not with the beginning of the war, but the very end, 1939. 75 years ago today, as a matter of fact, General Francisco Franco's forces entered Madrid. The city had been besieged since 1936, and Republican forces had held out that long. They fought tenaciously there. But finally, in 1939, the forces inside the city knew that they were beat, and Franco's forces came in essentially without firing a shot. They took the capital city. That enabled Franco to hold a triumphant victory parade several months later. I'm going to show you some images from that parade. And what might catch your eye is some of the imagery, some of the symbols that might look familiar. And this was on purpose. This was a general who understood what Mussolini and Hitler had done in their respective capitals, and he used a lot of that fascist symbology. And there is Franco up on the podium, known then as the caudillo, the military leader of Spain by that time. Not just a general, but the military leader had become a political leader as well. In front of the dais, you'll see Moroccan guards. The Moroccan soldiers that he put together, recruited in Morocco and brought over to Spain, played a huge role in the victory in the Spanish Civil War. They served as a bodyguard for Franco in this particular parade. There's another unit from Morocco. It's quite an odd thing to see a fervent Christian who thought he was on a crusade against the enemies of Christianity, of Western civilization, actually employ Muslim soldiers in this crusade. And if you look at this picture, it's quite interesting because Francisco Franco was a general in the Spanish Army. He has on his army uniform, but underneath you'll see a dark collar and a dark cuff. He's wearing the blue shirt of the Spanish Fascist Party called the Falange, or Phalanx, underneath his uniform. And on his head he has a red beret, which was symbolic headgear of the Carlist movement, a very arch-conservative monarchist movement that was part of his coalition as well. By 1939, after the defeat of the Republican forces, he's become a political leader who had brought together disparate movements and parties, often antagonistic, with different visions for Spain, brought them together in order to enable the victory of 1939. And he will continue to lead all of these movements after he consolidates political control in 1939 over Spain. Franco was not a monarchist or even really a fascist, but he, as I said, he was able to bring all of these forces together. We're going to get a little bit more into Francisco Franco's background in just a moment. Tonight, what I really want to talk about is how this man was able to do these things, defeat a legitimately elected government in the course of 3 years at great cost, but come out at the top in 1939 and stay in power until 1975. In order to do this, I'll need to discuss Spanish political affairs to some degree, as well as military affairs. I don't want to leave the war out completely. We'll talk about the course of the war. But we'll also need to understand the politics, both domestic and international, because actions and inaction by key European countries greatly affected the outcome of the Spanish Civil War. And conversely, the course of the Spanish Civil War greatly affected the course of European affairs, especially with regard to the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939. And while we're talking about that much larger conflict, the Second World War, I think it's critical to note, as I mentioned earlier, that it's hard for historians really to dwell long on the Spanish Civil War and trying to understand the Second World War. That larger conflict looms so large in history that historians tend to go right past the Spanish Civil War very quickly. And I'm as guilty as anyone in teaching undergraduates. I spend about 5 or 10 minutes typically talking about the Spanish Civil War, and then it's on to Austria in 1938 and the Munich Agreement, and then the attack on Poland in 1939. That's a disservice to the importance of this event. For many of the participants in the Spanish Civil War, the conflict in Spain was the European war that everybody had dreaded, or many people had dreaded, since the rise of Hitler in 1933. And that's because over the course of the Spanish Civil War, so much of Europe became involved. Certainly the governments of Germany and Italy and the Soviet Union, as well as individual volunteers from across the continent, indeed the world. And the ideologies that were in conflict in Spain between 1936 and 1939 were essentially those that would clash after 1939. So in this sense, the Spanish Civil War can be seen, indeed was seen, as the first chapter or campaign in the Second World War. That's just a slight variation on this idea that Spain's a dress rehearsal. You could also argue that really it's the first phase of the Second World War. The import of the war was magnified by contemporaries because it was the first major war on European soil since 1918. It was considered a great event in its magnitude, if not its the actual course of the war and all the horrific atrocities in combat that was part of it. For all these reasons, a large number of, shall we say, tourists went to Spain to participate or at least observe this great event. Ernest Hemingway, probably the best known in this country, who would go in 1937 and 1938 as a correspondent, but certainly a supporter of the Republican side, and would come back and write For Whom the Bell Tolls. George Orwell, who went in 1937 initially to write, but ended up joining the Republican side, fighting for a Marxist, communist militia, and then came home and wrote Homage to Catalonia. probably the best memoir about the actual war itself. Errol Flynn was there. Errol Flynn was there as a journalist. It was his excuse to go there and drive around and take part. There were reports back in the States that he had died, and he did not actually step up and say, "No, I'm really alive." He let that get out, and that served as sort of a help to his career. And of course, Pablo Picasso, whose great masterpiece we'll talk about later on. Not in Spain during the Civil War, but certainly a Spaniard, felt very, very tied to the action. Eventually will come down on the Republican side, but not all Spanish artists did. Salvador Dali actually supported the nationalist side, which is interesting. What I'd like to do now is just very quickly take you on a whirlwind survey of 500 years of Spanish history, because it's really not possible to understand how we get to 1936 the way that we do. Ultimately, it's not the Errol Flynns and the Hemingways who suffer in this war, it's the Spaniards themselves. They do the majority of the fighting, the suffering, and the dying. And they are also responsible for the origins of the war themselves. We can't blame that on any other European country. It's the Spaniards. So, going back in time about 500 years, if you were in Spain in the 1490s, you would not find a centralized state called Spain or a kingdom. It was a peninsula made up of disparate princedoms, like much of the rest of Europe. And only in the 1490s do you have two monarchs who come together, Isabel of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, and they begin to centralize power on the peninsula. There are many other regions of Spain besides Aragon and Castile that are jealous of this. They don't want to become part of a larger monarchy, and they will, over the next 500 years, continue to try to distance themselves from Madrid rule. Most important for our talk are the Basques who live in the northern provinces along the Pyrenees Mountains, and the Catalans who live in Catalonia in the northeast. In the Spanish Civil War, both groups will play a very important role. Beginning in the 1490s, as we all know, with the opening of the Americas to colonization, Spain begins to create an empire. It was very well situated in Europe to be able to do that, jutting out as it does into the Atlantic Ocean. It gets very wealthy to some degree over the next 200 or 300 years, mainly from extracting precious metals from the soils of South America and to some degree North America. The money that comes back from the Spanish Main to the Iberian Peninsula doesn't stay in Spain very long. It moves on to the bankers in places like Antwerp because empire takes a lot of resources like armies and navies. So that wealth was not invested in Spain itself. And Spain remained largely agrarian and somewhat static. The money actually ended up from the bankers in places like Amsterdam and London, and that's where you see the great commercial energy, not in Madrid or even Barcelona at the time. Spain in 1700 was monarchical in government and medieval in social structure. The small aristocracy owned much of the land on which generally impoverished peasantry labored. The church maintained a very important position in the Spanish power structure as well as in Spanish identity. To be Spanish was to be Catholic. Further, as the great Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno in the 20th century said, in Spain, even the atheists are Catholic. This is not to say that most of the population went to church or to Mass. Most didn't. But they were at least culturally Catholic, and the Catholic Church had a great amount of power and had owned a great amount of land. As the 18th century progressed and other parts of Western Europe began to change, influenced by the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, Spain remained, as I noted, largely static. Even as the radical ideas of the French Revolution erupted out of Paris and then were taken to the rest of Europe with French armies, in the 1790s, Spanish armies fought to keep those ideas and those armies out of the Iberian Peninsula. It's really only with the invasion by Napoleon's forces in 1808 that you start to see the influx of those ideas. The Bonapartist forces ostensibly go into the Iberian Peninsula on their way to Portugal. They want to fight Portugal, but they decided to stay in Spain. And immediately there's an insurgency, a reaction against French rule, a bloody one, and the insurgency will continue for years. Out of that insurgency comes this great work of art by Francisco Goya called The 3rd of May, 1808. This depicts, in 1808, the French reaction to this insurgency in Madrid. Goya, yes. The French soldiers are lined up like a machine almost, and there you had the very human victims of this French oppression. Critics note the symbology here of the insurgent about to be shot, his arms open, Christ-like, about to be sacrificed for Catholic Spain, and if you notice closely, it's almost hard to see, but there's stigmata on his right hand. We're going to see this again when we look at what Picasso does in 1937. The French occupation put Napoleon's brother on the Spanish throne and sparked a long guerrilla war against Bonapartist forces. Ultimately, though, the Bonapartes were pushed out of the peninsula, but some of the ideas of the French Revolution remained behind. In fact, Spain's 19th century is marked by a conflict between a restored Bourbon monarchy on the one hand and liberal reformers on the other. Liberal reformers bent on establishing a parliamentary type of government, the reactionaries insisting on keeping Spain traditional with a monarchy. Beginning in the 1830s, it became even more difficult for liberal reformers to push Spain towards modernity because they had to fight a series of wars against monarchist insurgents that championed the cause of Don Carlos. This is his picture. A member of the Bourbon family who was extremely conservative. The partisans of Don Carlos became known as Carlists, and I bring them up here because they will play a role in the Spanish Civil War 100 years later. For the remainder of the 19th century, a political settlement on major matters such as civil liberties, the role of the Catholic Church, land reform, and related issues was elusive. A succession of coups mounted by Spanish officers, army officers, made the system especially unstable. In 1873, however, a true republic was proclaimed. Within 2 years, another general had overthrown it and put in place a constitutional monarchy with the Bourbon king. And it's that political system that goes into the 20th century. It would last until 1931. Throughout this 19th century, Spain's economy languished, and its previous imperial glory grew tarnished. By the late 19th century, Spain had lost most of its holdings in the Americas and Asia. It did retain the Philippines, the island of Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, and some smaller territories in Northwest Africa. But in 1898, the disaster for Spain in the Spanish-American War took many of those colonies away. Certainly, we're talking about mainly the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. They were lost. Spain's fortunes rebounded in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Choosing, smartly perhaps, to sit out the First World War, the country benefited by selling goods to all sides. This demand spurred industrial growth, especially in Catalonia and Barcelona, becoming the chief industrial city of Spain. Along with this industrialization came the growth of a Spanish working class, a real, what you would be called an urban proletariat. And that created new problems, especially between factory owners and organized labor, the latter of which was often inspired by and organized around Marxist and anarchist ideologies. This would become a much bigger issue in the aftermath of the Great War, when the economic malaise following that war set in. And in the face of greater political instability, the Spanish army once again intervened in the form of a coup against the Spanish parliament. This is the man that took charge, Miguel de Rivera, who mounted his coup, took power in 1923. Actually, he was recognized by the Bourbon monarch, the king, as prime minister, and something exactly similar to what happened in Rome in Italy, where Mussolini had taken control, recognized as the prime minister by the Italian king. Primo de Rivera ran the Spanish state until 1930, and he had some successes. He modernized the infrastructure to some degree. He strengthened Spanish control over its colony in Morocco. And to some degree, mitigated the labor problems through using government bodies as mediators. All of this coincided happily with an economic recovery. And since we already mentioned Mussolini, let's bring him up. He inspired many leaders in Europe at this time. Of course, this is before the rise of Hitler, it's before the Holocaust. We don't understand yet. We don't have that connection between fascism and wide-scale warfare and atrocities. Mussolini famously made the trains run on time in Italy. That meant something. The other thing that Mussolini did and fascists were seeking was a way to cut through the debate and delay that was part of parliamentary systems. If you wanted to get something done, you didn't go to a parliament or to a Congress. You simply had a leader decide. That's what Mussolini offered. It's what Primo de Rivera generally had in mind, although he was not a fascist. The authoritarian rule that Primo de Rivera offered was at least some hope for Spaniards who were looking for a reform of their political system. He did not achieve that goal. Neither did he solve the much larger structural problems of land reform and the relationship between the church and these modern forces in Spanish society. And he never built a solid base of support for military rule. In 1930, Spain was hit by the Great Depression. Support for Primo's rule vanished and he stepped down, causing yet another crisis. In 1931, after municipal elections showed very little support for the monarchy, the king decided to just end the system by leaving the country. In the vacuum, I suppose it was the better part of valor at that point. So there's a political vacuum and a new republic was proclaimed, the Second Spanish Republic, not the first. With it came a new constitution that secured civil liberties, universal suffrage, including for women, allowed for divorce, and put restrictions on the Catholic Church. Further, the Constitution allows Spain's regions to establish autonomy. The Basques and the Catalans immediately acted on this. Other areas like Aragon later requested the status. What did the Republic stand for? Well, we can tell a little bit from this allegory that was published at the time. You can see the symbology is clearly Republican going back to the French Revolution. Liberty stands here with a liberty cap on, holding the scales of justice. Liberty, equality, and fraternity engraved in this shield down to the bottom left. And to the right, you can see all the accoutrements of modernity, of a modern economy, a modern state. Aircraft, ships, trains. This is what the Republic promised to those who were supporters of the Republic. But for conservatives in Spain, these symbols were tantamount to radical republicanism, even Bolshevism. The new constitution for them was an attack on traditional Spain. And immediately, after 1931 and the establishment of the Republic, there was a rift in the Spanish body politic that would only worsen over the next 5 years. And it was Spain's inability to heal this rift that led to the Civil War in 1936. We do need to look at the Spanish political spectrum, however briefly, just to understand where all these groups and what they believed. Starting from the left, we have the most radical group, the anarchists. And there was a long history of anarchism in Spain. It goes back further than even Marxist ideology and Marxist groups. They believed in devolving power down to small rural communes and even neighborhoods and urban settings. The state would wither away. There really wouldn't be a state. But to get to that point, they were willing to use violence. Slightly further towards the center, perhaps, was the Spanish Communist Party, a small party in the early 1930s, and a larger party, the Socialists. Somewhere in the middle were left Republicans and right Republicans. We would call them moderates. They were a small group mainly supported by the urban bourgeoisie, and that's about the only support that they had. Also on this side of the spectrum were the Catalans. Even though they did not ascribe to all the Republican ideas and the entire vision, they wanted the autonomy, so they threw in with the left. And the Basques. Also, in many ways, very, very culturally conservative, certainly very Catholic, but they threw in their lot with the left in this struggle. Let's go to the right now. Just to the outside of the center was a group called CEDA. It was a collection of rightist groups that claimed to be autonomous from all the other parties. So let's call them the moderate rightists. And then the Carlists, these arch-Catholic reactionaries that wanted to put a monarch back on the throne, no parliaments needed at all. And then to the far right, the Spanish Falange, the Falange, which was actually a fascist party. Small in 1933 when it was founded by the eve of the Spanish Civil War, it was upwards of 40 or 50,000. The Carlists and the Falange would happily use violence to get rid of the parliament. That was part of their philosophy, not unlike the National Socialists in Germany or the Italian fascists. And of course, all these parties worked together, they corresponded, they drew from each other's ideology. The further one got from the center, the less one found a willingness to compromise. Indeed, parties on the extreme used violent rhetoric and promised to practice violence to meet their objectives. These parties were revolutionary. I'll just underline this. They were revolutionary. They did not believe in a liberal parliamentary system, but they would involve themselves in elections in order to gain power and then use it against the very system that had allowed them to come to power, not unlike Adolf Hitler in Germany. How bad did the political climate become in the years just before the outbreak of the Civil War? In 1932, with a left-leaning government, parliamentary elections, they got a left-leaning government in 1932 in power, putting pressure on the church, entertaining louder cries for land reform. The commander of the Spanish Army, who had monarchist sympathies, led a coup attempt with other officers and monarchist organizations, especially the Carlists. The coup failed. In 1934, with a conservative, rightist government coming to power, the left called a general strike. They weren't going to tolerate rightists coming to power through the electoral system. That general strike sparked a 2-week armed rebellion by socialists and anarchists, especially in the north, especially in the province of Asturias. The army moved into Asturias and put the rebellion down violently. The general in charge was a man named Francisco Franco, and he became known from this event as the Butcher of Asturias. In 1936, faced with severe polarization in their politics, Spaniards went again to the polls with another choice, facing yet another election, the choice between a national front on the right, composed of monarchist and other rightist parties, and a popular front on the left, a coalition of the communists, socialists, and left Republicans. The moderate parties had basically disappeared by 1936. So in this election in 1936, the Popular Front won. But things only became worse. More street violence erupted between party paramilitary groups. The fascist Falange began attracting more members, as I mentioned, and the Popular Front did little to rein in this street violence. In July of 36, the Falange killed an anti-fascist politician. In retaliation, a well-known monarchist member of parliament was gunned down by the left. 3 days later, a collection of Spanish generals announced that they were taking power in Spain. This was essentially a coup d'etat. Franco, one of the leaders of the coup, was in Spanish Morocco. But army units across Spain rose up in support as part of the large conspiracy that had been planned for months. This was coming, actually. Some of these Spanish generals have been doing this for years, getting ready. In parts of Spain, however, some army commanders stayed on the side of the Republic and would fight for the Republic over the next 3 years. As a result, what was supposed to be a quick seizure of power in the long tradition of Spanish military intervention in politics became something quite different. A partly successful coup, which is no coup, right? Relatively quickly, that attempted coup became an outright war for the control of Spain. So a quick digression here about names and labels. You've heard me use the terms nationalist and Republican. So very quickly, the Spaniards that fought in support of the Republic have been known by most as Republicans, or loyalists, loyal to the elected government. This side called the nationalists, their enemies, rebels or fascists. Indeed, the generals, Franco and their supporters, had a problem. They had risen against a democratically elected government. They were, in fact, rebels. They were not all members of the fascist party, the Falange, yet they would draw support from domestic fascists as well as enjoy support from German government and the Italian government. Of course, what they tried to do when possible was call themselves nationalists. This is all about branding, right, and spin. So we're the nationalists, and what they tended to call the other side were the Bolsheviks, the communists, the anarchists. Many of the men on the right in Franco's group, especially the army, even used darker language, speaking of a Jewish Masonic Bolshevik conspiracy behind the Republican cause. It had to be eradicated like a virus is eradicated from the body. So from the very beginning, the rhetoric is extreme. It's going to be hard to bring two sides together in the course of this war to reach some kind of agreement. To describe the course of the war, I'd like to briefly examine the flow of operations in each year, briefly, 36, 37, and 38, and then focus on a few themes in each year that help understand the character of the war. So 1936, let's obviously start there. One more slide just to show you how the two sides coalesced in the war. The right, underneath the Nationalists, the Falange, the Carlists, the Seda, and the Spanish Foreign Legion fighting with the army of Franco, the Army of Africa. And the left, the socialists, the communists, anarchists, the Catalan forces, and the Basques. Each of these elements would bring troops to the field, and they would be in support of the Republican Army, the People's Army. On the Republic side, we have support from the Soviet Union. And bringing together all of the forces on the right is Francisco Franco. So before we jump into 36, a few comments about Francisco Franco. In 1936, he was 43 years old, a career army officer. He had joined the army in 1917, and soon after joining, he made his way to Spanish Morocco, where Spanish forces were involved in very bloody insurgency against a number of enemies. Franco quickly earned the reputation of being courageous, competent, serious, focused on his work. He was a devoted professional. And he also went about this counterinsurgency type of campaign with great enthusiasm, using great violence, like all the Spanish armies did in this case, against these insurgents. Franco himself, as a person, relatively short, 5'4", often had or took on or was given diminutive nicknames known as Franquito, little Franco, or the Comandantin, the little major. It wasn't a benefit that he also had a very high-pitched voice. But again, showed his courage, very competent in the field. While putting down the Moroccan insurgents, he helped found the Spanish Foreign Legion. He spent so much time, in fact, in Spanish Morocco that he became identified with a group of Spanish officers called the Africanistas. They created a base, if you will, in Spanish Morocco that will help him later on in the Civil War. In 1935, Franco had risen to the position of Chief of the General Staff. By that time, he had become an ardent conservative who shared the broad fear on the right of modern forces that threatened Spain. It would be untrue to say he was a fascist, but he shared many of the beliefs of European fascists at the time, especially anti-Semitism. He believed in this Masonic Jewish Freemason conspiracy and thought that it not only threatened Spain, but all of Western civilization. It's a little odd because there were very few Jews in Spain in the 1930s. So what Spanish fascists tend to think is that, or they tended to transfer their hatred to the Spanish working class, which is as close as they could get to the Jews, a scapegoat, the people that carried the virus of modernity with them. He was not a brilliant military leader, but as noted, very experienced and shrewd, understanding how to play both allies and enemies off of one another. This would become critical as a political leader once he became the caudillo of all of Spain in 1939. As noted, he was ruthless when it came to dealing with his enemies in Morocco, and he took the same stance during the Spanish Civil War. In his mind, there was no settlement, no compromise with the Republicans, because he was sure that they would destroy his Spain, the traditional Spain. When the coup became a civil war, Franco was in Spanish Morocco. He had organized a large force that included the Spanish Foreign Legion and the Moroccan forces that were called regulares. I'm going to quickly push up to this. But he had a problem. He had to get his forces from Spanish Morocco to Spain very quickly. The rest of the Civil War was beginning to brew up all across Spain. How could he get across? Almost immediately, the nationalists make contact with Mussolini and Hitler. And in less than a week, German planes are in Morocco and beginning to ferry Franco's forces across the ocean into Spain. Franco had to go this route because the Republican Navy did not all go over to the Nationalist side. Many of the vessels, many of the crews stayed loyal to the Republic. So from very early on, the Germans and the Italians have sided with the Nationalists. Having gotten this foreign support, we still have to say that if you looked at Spain in middle of 36 and looked at the forces that were arrayed, we have a very even tally, numbers-wise. The Republicans had about 90,000 troops across the country, the Nationalists about 130,000. The Republic did have some inherent advantages when it comes to the overall war effort. It controlled the mining and manufacturing centers in the north, especially in Catalonia. It benefited from the traditional trade exports of Spain, oranges, olive oil, and the like. It was, after all, the legitimately elected government. It should have been able to appeal, and did, to other democratic governments for assistance. And it had the substantial gold reserves in Madrid. At least it had them briefly. As nationalist forces approached Madrid, the Republican leaders decided to ship the gold out of the country to make sure it did not fall into the hands of Franco. 25% went to Paris. It was shipped over the Pyrenees to Paris, where it would remain for much of the war. I think some was expropriated and given to Franco's forces at some point in the war, certainly by 39. But 75% were put on ships and brought to Moscow. And there it remained for the rest of the war. Now, this was not a terrible idea because having gold in those two capitals meant that you had already prepaid for your airplanes and oil and the other things that you need for a war effort. And in fact, that's exactly what the gold was used for in most cases when it came to the Moscow gold. It didn't work out quite as well with the French. We'll talk a little bit more about that. It's a fascinating story. If you want to get into the details of what happens with the Moscow gold, actually put that term into Google, and it brings up a very intricate story about the gold reserves and what occurs with them. The Nationalists, though, were a better organized military force. In the early battles of 1936, in which they often fought against poorly trained militia on the Republican side, they showed a professional competency in attacking and easily broke the Republican formations put against them. And they would readily benefit from the men and material sent to Spain by Germany and Italy. The Republic would not receive the same level of help from the democracies of Europe or North America, despite its legitimacy. In fact, US companies were happily doing business with both sides. Texaco helped Franco substantially by supplying oil on credit, even after 1937, when this became illegal to do in this country. Still supplied oil on credit to Franco. That was critical for the nationalist war effort. So up in front of you is a map of the two areas controlled in Spain by the end of 1936. The Nationalists in pink, the Republicans in gray. You can see that after crossing into Spain, the main Nationalist Army, led by Franco, and manned by many regulares or Moroccans that he had brought over from Morocco, went straight up in the direction of Madrid, straight north. This was because Franco believed that to take Madrid right away would end the war. And so you see a very single-minded offensive in the direction of Madrid. As we know, it did not fall. The militia that were defending the city were tenacious. The conflict was greatly affected in 1936 by two themes. Now I want to get a little bit more into that before we move on to 37. First of all, the terror against civilians and the foreign assistance that we've already brought up. The war in Spain was not just a military conflict. It was a war of ideologies, which often chose not to recognize women, children, priests, and other civilians as non-combatants. Enemies were not just enemies, but evil, mortal threats that, unless annihilated, would be a constant threat to that side's vision for Spain. We know that both sides committed atrocities, committed political terror against civilian populations. Most examples on the Republican side came during the chaos of the first 3 or 4 months of the Civil War. This is a time in which scores were settled in villages and towns. Large landowners took the brunt of the violence, as well as right-wing groups in places where Republican forces prevailed. The church also became a target. You can see the picture, sort of a symbolic act of striking back at the church, Republican militiamen shooting at a statue of Jesus. Over 6,000 priests, bishops, monks, and nuns were killed in the violence during the entire Spanish Civil War, but most of that, or much of that, was in the first several months. In Republican areas, approximately 38,000 were killed during the terror in the 3 years of the Civil War. On the nationalist side, the terror was better organized. When the coup was announced, Franco's generals had described their movement as a purge of the Spanish people. Other leaders talked of a limpieza, a cleansing of Spain. And that's what would occur in the areas liberated by the nationalists. As they moved north from the coast up towards Madrid, the frontline troops were often followed by Falange members or Carlists, and they were the ones who did the bulk of the terror. Who were they after? Well, generally speaking, anybody who was associated with the Republic, definitely politicians, but also union leaders, intellectuals, doctors, and Freemasons, or anybody suspected of Freemasonry. They were imprisoned, many executed. The city of Cordoba was hit specifically hard by the nationalist terror, with 10,000 executed over the course of the war. Recent research has suggested that well over 100,000 were executed by the nationalists during the war. And when the post-war purges are added, this is 39, 40, 41, as Franco is making sure that his foes are suppressed. That number goes from 100,000 closer to 200,000. These are non-combatants we're talking about. While Franco's army moved toward Madrid in 1936, the rest of Europe reacted to the Spanish crisis. The Popular Front had immediately requested aid from the two great democracies of Western Europe, Great Britain and France. Both refused to assist. Why? Well, in the larger context of European politics, Spain was a sideshow, relatively speaking. The two democracies were focused on Germany, which in 1936 had just remilitarized the Rhineland, and Italy also rattling its saber off on its own African adventure in Abyssinia. The policy for both countries, France and Great Britain, was to avoid a widespread war by appeasing the two aggressive leaders. But among conservatives in Great Britain, it has to be said that there was a common fear of the left and even some sympathy for fascism. They certainly did not want to support the Popular Front, which some believed was a proxy for Soviet power in the West. So both countries chose to formally avoid intervention in support of the Spanish Republic through 1939 and tried to ensure that other countries did not. France and Great Britain actually set up the non-intervention committee to try to prevent anybody from getting involved. The committee failed in a spectacular fashion. As we already know, German and Italian assistance is right there immediately helping Franco. Both Hitler and Mussolini saw Spain as a potential strategic partner on the flank of Western Europe. Further, they wanted to use Spain as a testing ground for their new weapons and tactics. Germany and Italy both began sending in entire units of volunteers, not really, but that's what they were called, forces that initially were envisioned to train nationalist soldiers on modern aircraft and tanks. Eventually, the volunteers became active combatants, pilots flying Luftwaffe planes, German soldiers manning artillery. The Italian Corpo Truppe Volontari was the largest of these formations, over 40,000 Italian volunteers, most of whom made up infantry units. They fought with Franco's forces on the front lines. But better known and far more decisive was the German Condor Legion that was formed in Spain in the fall of 1936. This unit of volunteers included pilots and their aircraft, as well as tank and artillery specialists, along with their weapon systems. At any one time, there were approximately 5,000 Germans in the Condor Legion, and the force remained in Spain throughout the war until 1939. They gave Franco a decisive advantage over the Republican Army in their ability to supply ground support from the sky. Yes, bombing of towns, and we'll get to that, but more importantly, helping out on the battle lines, blowing holes that nationalist infantry could then take advantage of. They were very efficient, very professional. The Non-Intervention Committee also failed to keep the Soviet Union from intervening. Like Hitler, Stalin saw Spain as a potential ally and a future communist state, perhaps in the future. Soviet volunteers and equipment also began flowing into Spain in 1936. Soviet specialists brought in modern tanks and fighter aircraft. In the first 18 months of the Civil War, the Soviet planes and their pilots could at times stand up to the Condor Legion. But when Hitler began sending his most modern equipment, the Messerschmitt 109, which would fight American pilots over the skies of Europe, right? And also the Stuka dive bomber, when these got into the fight in 1938, Soviet equipment was outclassed. Here we have a Soviet fighter, a biplane, and yes, there were biplanes that fought over Spain in 1936 and 1937, but the Soviets could not keep up with the German technology. Not only fighters and dive bombers, but also heavier bombers, both Italian, like you see here, and German medium and heavy bombers as well. The tanks tended to be of earlier varieties that you would not see in World War II. This is a Soviet tank. But the tanks were never used like you would see after 1939, especially by the Germans. They were used in support of infantry, and you never see the kind of breakthroughs and large-scale offensives that would come to characterize the German campaign in France, the German campaign in Poland, and what the Western Allies bring over later on in the war. But there were tanks on both sides. With his weapons, Stalin also sent his secret police, who served as advisors in Republican units and would try to ensure that Spanish Republican politicians and military leaders followed Stalin's line. They were doing what Stalin wanted. Another type of foreign intervention came in the form of true volunteers, and this is for both sides. Irish, Portuguese, French, and even Russian exiles, white Russians, volunteered to fight for Franco against the communist threat. But better known are the international brigades that flocked to the Republican side. These units were made up of Europeans from all countries, the French, the Germans, the Hungarians, and on, as well as Americans who believed in leftist causes and saw Franco's forces as evil to be defeated. All told, over 35,000 volunteers went to Spain to support the Republic from over 50 countries. At any one time, there were 20,000 volunteers in these international brigades. They were viewed as elite forces, and some were actually veterans of the Great War, knew how to fight, were somewhat trained. But the Republican Army relied on them to lead offensives, and thus there were heavy casualties among the international brigades and even mutinies when they got sick of being used in the vanguard, in the meat grinder. Late in the war, when some brigadistas wanted to leave Spain to go home, they were detained by communist commissars and put into re-education camps. Obviously, their politics had gotten screwy while at the battle line, so they had to be taught what was right and good. Some were let go, some were put back on the front lines. Probably the best known of these units in the United States was the Abraham Lincoln Battalion. And here you see a picture of some of those young Americans. This is the Tom Mooney Company of the Abraham Lincoln Battalion. But there were other battalions as well. There was the George Washington Battalion, there was the John Brown Artillery Battery, and many others. They arrived in 1937, most of them, and they leave in 1938 when all the international brigades departed in late 1938. The thinking that if, on the Republican side, that if we asked our volunteers, our international volunteers to leave, then Franco will ask the Germans and Italians to leave. Gives you a glimpse into sort of the psychology on the Republican side. Things aren't going well, we'll try this. Let's move on to 1937. That year began with Franco's decision to give up the attempt to try to take Madrid and win the war outright by seizing Madrid itself. Instead, move north to split Republican territory. And so the idea, if I showed you the previous map, you'd see the Republican territory went all the way across. Franco's deciding to move north towards the town of Bilbao, industrial city, very wealthy, relatively speaking, industry. And again, it would separate Republican territory. Bilbao was close also to the Carlist heartland of Navarre province. As he got closer, Franco was assured of receiving a great deal of assistance from these monarchist allies. The national offensive went well that spring. The Condor Legion combined with Franco's troops and pushed Basque forces further and further to the north towards Bilbao. The Condor Legion worked very well with the Spanish general staff. They had become quite adept 1 year into the war at bombing Republican positions, as I mentioned, at disrupting defenses that the slow-moving nationalist infantry could exploit. In April, as their Basque enemies fell back towards Bilbao, the Condor Legion commanders decided to interdict the Republican retreat by bombing a small town near Bilbao, just south of Bilbao, that was called Guernica. Guernica is a small town, but great cultural meaning for the Basque people. On Monday, April 26, there were few, if any, Republican troops in Guernica. A single bomber flew over late in the afternoon and dropped a single bomb. This was followed by a fighter aircraft that strafed anyone they saw in the streets or fields, men, women, children, livestock. They departed, and then the heavy bombers started flying over Guernica. In the course of 2.5 hours, they dropped 5,000 bombs of various sizes, including incendiaries. The rubbled city caught fire. Hundreds were killed, hundreds more wounded, the great majority civilians. That was what was left of Guernica. Guernica was not the first city bombed in the Spanish Civil War. Madrid had been bombed in '36. And it would not be the last. Barcelona would take on the onslaught of nationalist aircraft later on in the war. But this event caught the attention of the international press and was portrayed outside of Spain as an atrocity because the bombing appeared to have no military purpose whatsoever. The nationalists officially denied that they were responsible for this attack. They blamed Republican terrorists who used dynamite to do that. But even during the war, some nationalist leaders talking to the media happily took credit for the action. Further, it's clear that the Condor Legion's intent was not just to interdict Basque troops retreating through the city, but to destroy the city entirely. Why else the incendiaries? Perhaps the overall intent was to discover if an entire urban population could be terrorized into submission. That remains unclear, even in 2014, and people are still arguing about Guernica. For many, that was almost beside the point, the intent, beside the point. And the point was that Franco and his German allies did not hesitate to plan and conduct an operation that they knew would result in the death and maiming of thousands of civilians, not to mention the destruction of a city. This seemed a particularly horrific innovation in warfare in 1937. So much so that Pablo Picasso, the great Spanish artist living in Paris, decided to try to capture the horror of Guernica on canvas. That spring, over the course of 2 months, he painted a large mural titled Guernica. The painting is 27 feet long and 12 feet high. Picasso refused to explain the symbology. I don't think it's necessary. And I think anybody who's looked at this painting can see what it's about. Some people, some critics especially, suggest that what Picasso was doing was creating a modern cubist version of the traditional history painting in European tradition. I'm sure you're familiar with these. He was bringing his own style, his own thoughts to that. In fact, some have even pointed out that to some degree, he's updating Goya's 3rd of May, 1808. Both have a central figure stretching out their arms in a Christ-like pose. And this figure has stigmata. You can buy it or you can reject it. Regardless, it's a powerful statement about warfare in general and about the Spanish Civil War. Further, I think it's considered widely as a modern masterpiece. It might be the most recognizable work of Western art from the last century. Not surprisingly, though, it did not find a home in Spain until after Franco was dead. Between 1937 and 1981, the painting moved around Europe and around the world, indeed, spent the bulk of its time in New York's Museum of Modern Art. Only in '81, with Franco dead, and for 6 years, did it go back to Spain, which is where it is now. The fight for the north of Spain would continue until the late summer of 1937. But by September, Franco has successfully split Republican territory in half. Another event, which I'll mention just briefly, is the fact that at the same time that this was going on, essentially, there was a civil war among leftist parties in Barcelona. This is what Orwell sees and experiences and writes about in Homage to Catalonia. The socialists and the communists decided that they had to put down the anarchists and a small offshoot Bolshevik party called the POM. There's a street war in Barcelona. The result of this is that a essentially communist-controlled new prime minister comes to power. And from that point on, the Communist Party in Spain, with their Soviet advisors, is to a large degree influencing political decisions and military decisions on the Republican side. And what the communists thought should be done with the Republican Army is to attack, to mount offensives, even when Republican Army forces weren't ready. They had to go on the offensive, and that would have a cost. Some shots from Barcelona during the street fighting, and I wanted to include this photo of this group of militia because that's George Orwell right there. Let's turn to 1938. The two sides remained equal in strength, about 700,000 on each side, but Franco retained the resources of the North that he had won and the superior arms of the Condor Legion, which made a difference on the battlefield. The course of the war continued to go in the nationalist favor. After splitting Republican territory in half by driving north in 1937, Franco turned his forces east, and by April 1938, had gotten all the way to the Mediterranean coast. So this is, by July 1938, this is nationalist territory, and this is Republican. The idea after getting to the Mediterranean coast was to isolate Catalonia and Barcelona, its capital. This campaign worked. By this time, there was a broad consensus among everyone, including Republican politicians, that the Republic could no longer win the war. And so by the spring of 1938, you have very quiet feelers being put out to the nationalist side. How can we reach an agreement? Can we sue for peace? Can we reach a compromise? The caudillo was not interested. The general pessimism about the Republican cause grew to the point that the Soviet Union stopped sending in advisors and material. By the summer of 1938, the threat to Catalonia was so great that the Republicans launched their biggest offensive to try to blunt the nationalist onslaught. This was along the Ebro River, southwest of Barcelona, and it was initially a great success for the Republican forces. But by 1938, they really didn't have any great means to consolidate the success. They were not a mobile force. They didn't really know how to use their tanks, those that were left and still running, to turn a tactical victory into something much larger. The Battle of the Ebro lasted 3 months and ended when the nationalists, enjoying total air superiority, could do what they wanted in the air against Republican forces on the ground, when the nationalist forces counterattacked. In the counterattack, the Republicans lost almost all of their artillery and other heavy weapons. Both sides in this battle lost an enormous amount of casualties, over 20,000 dead and over 50,000 wounded. From the Ebro, Franco's forces moved inexorably toward Barcelona. As the winter arrived, the nationalists began bombing the city while its population starved. This was Spain's second city. One can imagine what the fall of Barcelona would mean to the Republic. Well, in late January, that's exactly what happened. The remaining Republican Army forces in Catalonia retreated from the city, ceding it to the nationalists. It's estimated that 500,000 Republican soldiers and civilian sympathizers and politicians moved north across the Pyrenees into France, where many were put into concentration camps or detention camps, and then met different fates after the war, after 1940, and then when the Nazis took over. The Republic would hold out another 2 months until March of 1939, but the end was certain by that point. As I noted at the beginning of my talk, Franco's army entered Madrid in late March of 1939, essentially without incident. The Civil War was over. The final human toll was astounding, approximately 500,000 lives lost. Of that number, roughly 350,000 lost in battle, the remaining 150,000 victims of the terror perpetrated by both sides. But the suffering continued as the new Franco government began inflicting further violence against anyone they knew or believed had been part of the Republican cause. That repression would go on for over a decade, and Franco's authoritarian grip on Spain would continue. all the way up until his death in 1975. But Franco's crusade had been successful. What he set out to do in 1936, he accomplished. By 1939, he had defeated his immediate enemies. And they would remain defeated while he ruled. In 1975, by the way, and earlier on he had identified a member of the Bourbon monarchy to succeed him. And this was Juan Carlos. And before I bring Juan Carlos's picture up, just want you to see where Franco is buried. It's a site called the Valle de los Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen, initially a monument to the fallen in the Spanish Civil War, but it becomes a basilica and the resting place of Franco himself. Not very far from Madrid, and to some degree built by Republican prisoners. Not entirely, but they participated in the construction of this monument to Franco. Don't have time tonight to talk about it, but this particular place remains a huge issue for Spaniards today. What to do with it, what to do with Franco's body. And by the way, Jose Antonio de Primavera is also buried here, the head of the Spanish Phalange. So it's more than just Franco at this particular memorial. In 1975, though, Juan Carlos takes over and immediately begins disassembling the Francoist authoritarian state, moving Spain clearly towards democracy. Franco had, of course, left his mark outside of Spain as well. The Spanish Civil War, in fact, became a test case for Europe's major powers. Who would actively intervene? Who would remain passive? The two major democracies attempted to purchase peace on the continent by sacrificing smaller states: Austria, Czechoslovakia, and yes, Spain. Two dictators, Hitler and Mussolini, had taken bold action in Spain and elsewhere and saw that military force was rewarded. The Soviet Union had also intervened in Spain. But more importantly, Stalin saw that Western appeasement would not satisfy Hitler and that the Western democracies would not stand up to Germany. So in August of 1939, Stalin made a wager on the strong by signing a pact with Adolf Hitler that paved the way for the dismemberment of Poland. This was Stalin's way of coming to terms with Hitler to prevent the Nazi leader from targeting the Soviet Union. And it's clearly arguable that those reactions were a result of what went on in Spain or didn't go on in Spain. In 1939, as Stalin and Hitler signed that pact, in Madrid, the Spanish caudillo settled into his long rule. He had won his war and secured his country and watched as the rest of Europe fell into the abyss. Thank you.
John says he's happy to answer questions. Just one quick note that supposedly during the war, Guernica was hanging in Picasso's studio in Paris, where he stayed during the German occupation. This is probably not true, but it's a great story. Supposedly 2 German officers walked in, looked at it, and said to Picasso, "Did you do that?" And he said, "No, you did." So we'll let Don answer questions, please.
Yes. I realize I'm jumping ahead about 4 years, but I reference Rick Atkinson's first volume of his trilogy, and Ike set up his headquarters in a cave on Gibraltar. You're probably going to have to correct me on my geography, but wasn't that a part of Spain?
He set up his headquarters in Spanish Morocco. It was important. The question is, was Spain so important in 1942 that when the Allies invaded North Africa, Ike wanted to at least establish some control or headquarters in Spanish Morocco?
Well, but why weren't the Germans, what a place to defend?
Okay, why weren't the Germans in Spanish Morocco?
Why weren't they still there?
This is a great question.
I didn't even realize there was a Spanish Morocco until I read this book.
Okay. Very confusing because the rest of North Africa belongs to the Vichy French at that time and their German forces in Tunisia and elsewhere. Franco decided not to get involved in the Second World War. He remained neutral. There's a lot of debate about what he really intended, because in 1940 he has a meeting with Hitler, and he proposes to come in on the Axis side, but he wants lots of Africa in compensation, and he wants a lot of material, troops, equipment from Hitler. And Hitler thought the price was too high. And so because of that, Franco doesn't get into the war. He's neutral. Thus, Spanish Morocco is also neutral in 1942 when Operation Torch goes into effect. There's a question among historians, did Franco really want to get involved in the war, or did he just make the price so high he knew that Hitler would never agree? And that was his way of sort of walking the line. Also important, for all the anti-Semitic rhetoric among Franco's colleagues and Franco himself, he allows Jews to move into Spain to run away from the Holocaust. He does not get involved in rounding up Jews in Europe. So it's quite interesting, his stance during the Second World War. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, but then was the real reason Hitler did not want to use the resource because it was tied up?
Well, certainly Axis forces in North Africa were relatively short. There wasn't enough to cover that entire area. Too far over, yeah. Just not enough forces to take all that. I think there's a question here first.
In your photographs, it appeared that there were women serving in the volunteer American troops. Were they serving as soldiers, or did they have another role?
I haven't come across women in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, or it's quite possible. I didn't see that, but it's possible. I can tell you that there were women serving in Republican militias, for sure. Especially the left lean of the communists and the anarchists definitely brought women into the force and armed them. They were ferocious fighters, yeah. I'll have to look that up. There was a question over here.
Question, Hitler and Franco, very briefly, how did the Spanish Blue Division figure in the Moscow campaign?
Oh, boy.
Franco didn't want any part of World War II, and he gave them 100,000 troops.
The Blue Division, the question is about the Blue Division that fought for Hitler on the Eastern Front. I don't know a lot about that. Why did he do it? Because, again, he's walking this fine line. From what I remember, they were mostly members of the Falange, and they were volunteers. He allowed them to go fight. He didn't stop them from fighting. But that wasn't enough to bring him into the war, either from the perspective of the Allies or from the perspective of the Axis. But there were all kinds of volunteers or forces like that fought. The Bulgarians, some of the other Axis allies were involved in the Eastern Front as well. Two more.
Just two more.
Could you say something about why the Navy mostly supported the Republic, and did it stay supporting them, or did they walk the line of, skipping out once they saw? Because of course you could always sail your ship to another port.
The question is about the Navy. From what I have seen in my research, on the ships in which the crew defied their officers that were often nationalist, they stayed on the Republican side. But the Republican Navy really doesn't do a whole lot during the war. In fact, it's really the nationalist portion of the Navy that takes the fight to them, and they have the help of the Italian and the German Navy. So by the end of the war, really, there's not much left of a Republican Navy. But initially, it's really about the crews. Which side do they go? They go towards. That's the best answer I can give on that one. One more? Sorry.
Could you speak just a little bit about Juan Carlos? When I was there in '74, they told horrible fool jokes about him, and then he turns around and saves the democracy.
The question is about Juan Carlos himself. I can't confess to know a lot about him. Yes, it's quite interesting that he was, by the way, he was groomed by Franco to be the successor. He lived in Spain, served in the Spanish Army, was essentially somebody who Franco thought would follow in his footsteps. He groomed Juan Carlos to do that. So I think he does come across as something like a bon vivant or a typical member of the European monarchy, but maybe that was all a sly approach to deal with the caudillo. And when he does come to power, it's amazing. When he is brought in after Franco's death, one of the first things he does is start talking to leftist labor unions, those that he could contact, because it's very clear he immediately wants some kind of rapprochement between Franco's Spain and the forces that were the power bases in Franco's Spain and the other Spain that had been purged and exiled. And he's successful in doing that. Beyond that, I can't tell you a lot about the character of the king. Thank you.
Thank you. Please give Don a thank you for an enlightening talk. I hope you're enjoying the 1939 series, and we hope to see you on April 30th. Thank you very much.